The smell of stale coffee and exhaust fumes clung to my uniform as I pulled into the driveway. 48 hours of surveillance will do that to you. Make you forget what your own bed feels like, what real food tastes like, what silence sounds like when it isn't filled with radio chatter and distant sirens. I should have gone home to my apartment, should have stripped off this badge and these boots and collapsed into my own sheets. Instead, something pulled me toward this house. The house where I grew up. The house where my mother still lived alone. The engine ticked as it cooled, that familiar metallic whisper that comes after long miles. I sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching the windows for movement. No lights on yet, even though dusk was settling over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket. The porch light should have been glowing by now. Mom always turned it on before dark, a habit drilled into her by years of waiting for people to come home safe. My boots crunched on the gravel walkway. Each step felt heavier than the last, though I couldn't say why. The front door stood slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual. Mom had always believed in open doors, fresh air, the kind of trust that small towns used to afford. But something about the silence from inside made my chest tighten. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. The kind that feels like holding your breath. I pushed the door open wider and called out. My voice echoed through the hallway, bouncing off walls that had heard too many conversations, too many arguments, too many apologies that never quite fit right. The house smelled like lemon dish soap and something else, something metallic that made my training kick in before my heart could catch up. She was in the kitchen, standing at the sink with her back to me. Her shoulders were curved inward, protective, like she was shielding something from view. Her hands moved slowly through the soapy water, the rhythm mechanical, practiced. This was the same woman who had bandaged my scraped knees, who had packed my lunch with notes tucked between sandwiches, who had taught me that strength could be quiet. The afternoon light caught the side of her face as she turned slightly. Purple bloomed around her right eye like a storm cloud, dark at the center and spreading outward in shades of pain. Her knuckles were swollen, the skin scraped raw, as if she had tried to fight back, as if her hands had connected with something harder than they were. Time stopped. Not the way it does in movies with dramatic music and slow motion. Time stopped the way it does when your world tilts sideways and you have to remember how to breathe. I had seen injuries like this before, too many times, in other people's kitchens, in other people's lives, with other people's mothers who looked at me with eyes that begged me to understand without making them say the words out loud. She glanced at me, startled for just a heartbeat, then returned her attention to the dishes. Her voice came out soft, rehearsed, like she had been practicing what to say if anyone asked. The same tone I had heard from countless women over the years, women who had learned to make excuses sound like explanations, who had perfected the art of deflection. I stepped closer, my training warring with my heart. The cop in me wanted to document, to ask questions, to follow protocol. The daughter in me wanted to wrap her in my arms and promise that this would never happen again. But I had learned long ago that promises were fragile things, easily broken by hands that were stronger than the words meant to stop them. My phone buzzed against my hip. The sound cut through the kitchen silence like a blade. I almost ignored it, almost let it ring through to voicemail. But something made me look. A message from a number I didn't recognize. Just a link, nothing else. I tapped it with fingers that had started to tremble. The screen filled with an image that made my stomach drop into my boots. There he was. My father. Standing on the deck of a yacht I had never seen before, his arm draped around a woman who definitely wasn't my mother. She was young, maybe half his age, with red lips and wind-blown hair that caught the sunlight like spun gold. He held a champagne flute in his free hand, raised toward the camera in a toast to whatever lie he was living. The caption beneath the photo read like a slap across the face. Simple words that carried the weight of years, the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He looked happy, relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world, like he hadn't left bruises on the woman who had loved him for 30 years. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. Every instinct I had developed as a cop, every protective barrier I had built around my heart, crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. This wasn't just infidelity, this wasn't just a midlife crisis played out in expensive clothes and younger women. This was a pattern, a system, a carefully constructed web of control that had kept my mother trapped while he lived like a king. I looked up at her, still standing at that sink, still moving her hands through water that had probably gone cold. She hadn't asked about the phone, hadn't turned to see what had made me go so still. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she had been waiting for this moment, for someone else to see what she had been living with, what she had been hiding behind closed doors and careful makeup. The weight of my badge pressed against my chest. 20 years of training, 20 years of promising to protect and serve, 20 years of standing between victims and the people who hurt them. But I had never imagined that the victim would be the woman who taught me right from wrong, who showed me what courage looked like even when it wore the disguise of submission. I walked out of that kitchen without saying another word. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to trust myself with words. I went to my old bedroom, the room that still held pieces of the girl I used to be. Posters long gone, but the furniture remained. The memories remained. And in the corner, beneath a quilt my grandmother had made, sat the black safe where I kept the things that mattered most, my service weapon, evidence envelopes from cases that had changed me, and a slim leather case that held my badge, the gold shield that gave me the authority to act when others could only watch. Beneath the badge, tucked into the silk lining, was an envelope I had sealed months ago. Insurance, I had called it then. A plan for the day when planning would matter more than hoping. The law firm's name was embossed in raised letters across the cream-colored paper. Peterson and Associates. The kind of lawyers who didn't advertise on bus benches, who didn't promise easy solutions or quick fixes. The kind who built cases like architects built foundations, with patience and precision, and an understanding that some battles required more than good intentions. I slipped the badge into my jacket pocket, feeling its familiar weight settle against my ribs. The envelope went under my arm, light as a feather, but heavy as a promise. I kissed my mother's temple as I passed through the kitchen one more time. She still didn't look up, still didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. But I felt her shoulders relax slightly under my touch, felt some small tension release as if she knew, somehow, that help was coming. The drive back to my car felt like walking through deep water. Every step deliberate, every breath measured. I had responded to hundreds of domestic calls over the years, had seen the aftermath of violence in too many homes to count, but I had never been on this side of it, had never felt the cold rage that comes when someone you love becomes someone else's victim. I sat in the driver's seat and dialed the number I had memorized but never hoped to use. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional even at this hour. I didn't waste time with pleasantries, didn't explain the circumstances or ask for advice. I spoke 3 words that carried the weight of 20 years of watching, waiting, and building a case I prayed I would never need to make. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then came his voice, measured and careful, giving me one last chance to change my mind, to step back from the precipice I was about to leap from. But there was no stepping back now. Not from this. Not from him. The sun was setting as I hung up the phone, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Beautiful, if you could ignore the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. I started the engine and pulled away from my mother's house, knowing that when I returned, everything would be different. Justice, I had learned, was not always loud. Sometimes it moved like shadows, patient and persistent, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. The law office smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, the kind of place where serious conversations happened behind heavy wooden doors. I had been here before, but never like this. never carrying evidence of my own family's destruction in a manila envelope that felt heavier than my service weapon. Peterson looked exactly like what you'd expect from a lawyer who specialized in cases that never made the headlines but always mattered. Silver hair, steel-rimmed glasses, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of watching powerful people discover they weren't untouchable after all. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if I wanted any. The ritual gave us both time to settle into what was coming next. I had called him months ago when the first whispers reached my desk. Rumors about my father's business dealings, stories that circulated in the shadows where cops and contractors sometimes crossed paths. Nothing concrete then, nothing actionable. But enough to make me start asking questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. The envelope made a soft sound as it hit his mahogany desk. Inside were photographs, bank statements, property records, witness statements from people brave enough to speak truth to power. A paper trail that stretched back years, connecting dots that painted a picture of a man who believed rules where suggestions and consequences were for other people. Peterson opened the envelope with the careful movements of someone who had seen too many families torn apart by secrets. He spread the contents across his desk like pieces of a puzzle, each document adding another layer to the story we were about to tell. His eyes moved methodically from page to page, occasionally making notes in handwriting that looked like it belonged in another century. The photographs were the hardest to look at. Not just the ones from today showing my mother's bruised face and swollen hands, but the older ones, dating back years. Hospital visits explained away as accidents, emergency room records with injuries that followed suspicious patterns, a timeline of violence hidden behind closed doors and careful lies. The financial records told their own story. Money moving through shell companies, properties purchased and sold at prices that defied market logic, bank accounts in names that didn't appear on any tax returns. My father had built an empire on foundations that wouldn't survive scrutiny. He had grown careless over the years, confident that his reputation would shield him from questions. Peterson's voice was quiet when he finally looked up from the papers. He asked if I understood what we were about to unleash, what it would mean for my family, my career, my relationship with a community that had always seen my father as a pillar of respectability. I told him I understood perfectly. Some pillars were built on sand. The plan we crafted that night was surgical in its precision. We would move simultaneously on multiple fronts, filing papers that would freeze assets, secure protective orders, and trigger investigations that had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. My father's world would collapse not with a single devastating blow, but with the slow, inexorable pressure of legal machinery grinding through his carefully constructed lies. I drove home through empty streets, my phone buzzing with messages I didn't read. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by morning, everyone would know that something significant had shifted. The daughter who had always stayed quiet, who had always played by the rules, had finally decided to change the game entirely. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door, not physically changed, but somehow lighter, as if removing a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I made tea I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table with files spread before me like tarot cards revealing an unwelcome future. Each document represented years of careful documentation, patient investigation, the kind of methodical police work that built cases strong enough to survive courtroom battles. The phone rang just after midnight. My father's voice came through the speaker with the controlled fury of a man who had just discovered his world was burning down around him. He demanded explanations, threatened consequences, used the tone he had perfected over decades of making people smaller than himself. I listened without interrupting, letting him reveal exactly who he was when his mask finally slipped. When he finished, the silence stretched between us like a chasm that had always been there but was only now visible. I told him that I was a cop first, a daughter second, and that justice didn't recognize family loyalty when crimes had been committed. The line went dead with a click that sounded like a door closing on 30 years of pretending things were different than they were. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, I sat by my window watching the darkness slowly give way to dawn, thinking about the calls that would start coming soon. From reporters, from colleagues, from friends who would want to know how I could turn against my own father. But I had learned something important in my years wearing this badge. Sometimes protecting your family means protecting them from each other. The morning news broke the story with the kind of breathless excitement that local media reserved for scandals involving prominent citizens. My phone started ringing before I finished my first cup of coffee. I let every call go to voicemail, not ready to explain to the world what should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. The evidence spoke for itself. Peterson called just after 9 with updates that came faster than either of us had expected. Bank accounts frozen, properties seized. Federal investigators suddenly very interested in construction, contracts that had always seemed too profitable to be legitimate. My father's empire was crumbling in real time, each revelation triggering new investigations that revealed deeper layers of corruption. But it was the call from my mother that mattered most. Her voice was different somehow, stronger despite everything she had endured. She thanked me without saying what for, and I understood that some conversations happen in the spaces between words. She was safe now, protected by court orders that carried the full weight of the law behind them. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when I arrived for the first hearing. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, voices calling questions I had no intention of answering. I walked through the chaos with my head held high, my badge visible on my jacket like armor against their curiosity. This wasn't about spectacle. This was about accountability. Inside, the courtroom felt like a cathedral built for truth-telling. My father sat at the defendant's table with lawyers who had been hired to perform miracles, but were quickly learning that miracles required something more than money. His mistress sat in the gallery, her red dress replaced by conservative black, her confident smile nowhere to be found. The judge was a woman who had built her reputation on being unmoved by wealth, status, or the kind of influence that usually bought silence in small towns. She reviewed the evidence with the methodical attention of someone who understood that justice was often found in details others preferred to ignore. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of years spent watching powerful men learn that power had limits. The proceedings unfolded with the inexorable logic of well-prepared cases. Witnesses testified, documents were entered into evidence, bank records revealed patterns that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. My father's lawyers made their arguments, but you could see in their faces that they knew they were fighting a battle that had been lost before it began. It began. The moment came when my father's lead attorney stood to address the court. He was expensive, the kind of lawyer whose hourly rate could buy a decent car. His suit was impeccable, his confidence manufactured, his words polished to a shine that couldn't quite hide the desperation underneath. He spoke about misunderstandings, about vindictive family members, about the rush to judgment that destroyed innocent men. But innocence, I had learned, wasn't something you could purchase with platinum credit cards and offshore accounts. It was something you earned through choices, through the small daily decisions that either built character or eroded it. My father had made his choices decades ago, and now those choices sat in manila folders marked as evidence. The prosecutor was younger than I expected, maybe 5 years out of law school, with the kind of hunger that comes from believing the system can still work when good people refuse to stay silent. She didn't raise her voice or pound tables for dramatic effect. She simply laid out the facts with surgical precision, each piece of evidence building on the last until the pattern became undeniable. Bank records showed money flowing through shell companies like water through cupped hands, property deals that made no sense unless you understood they were designed to hide rather than profit. Construction contracts awarded to the lowest bidder who somehow always managed to be my father's company, despite bids that defied basic mathematics. Then came the personal testimony. My mother took the stand wearing a simple blue dress. Her bruises faded but still visible under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. Her voice never wavered as she described years of walking on eggshells, of making excuses for injuries that weren't accidents, of believing she deserved whatever happened behind closed doors. The defense attorney tried to shake her story, suggesting she was a scorned wife seeking revenge through false accusations. But my mother had something more powerful than anger. She had truth, and truth has a weight that lies can never match. She answered every question with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. The financial expert took 3 hours to explain what my father had spent years trying to hide. Shell companies layered like Russian dolls, each one designed to obscure the source of money that flowed upward toward accounts in countries that didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Property flipped between entities he controlled, inflating values on paper while real cash disappeared into digital shadows. My father's mistress was called as a witness for the prosecution. She walked to the stand in shoes that cost more than most people made in a month, but her confidence had cracked like expensive porcelain. Under oath, she admitted to signing documents she didn't understand, to depositing checks that came with instructions not to ask where the money originated. She described yacht parties where handshake deals were made over champagne and caviar, construction permits that moved through City Hall faster than normal processing allowed, inspectors who found violations on Monday but approved the same work by Friday after lunches that lasted 3 hours and cost more than their monthly salaries. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of the court reporter's fingers and the occasional creak of wooden benches as spectators shifted in their seats. This wasn't entertainment. This was the slow, methodical dismantling of a life built on other people's pain. During a recess, I stepped outside for air that didn't taste like old wood and nervous sweat. The courthouse steps were still crowded with reporters, but they had learned to give me space after my attorney made it clear I wouldn't be answering questions. I stood in the shadow of marble columns that had witnessed decades of justice, both served and denied. My phone buzzed with a text from Peterson. The federal investigators had found something in my father's business records that changed the scope of their inquiry. What had started as financial fraud was expanding into racketeering, conspiracy, possibly even tax evasion on a scale that made local prosecutors call colleagues in larger cities who handled bigger crimes. When court resumed, the mood had shifted. The judge's expression was harder, more focused. The prosecution team had added another attorney, someone whose presence suggested this case had grown beyond what a small-town courthouse usually handled. My father's lawyers whispered among themselves with the urgency of people trying to plug holes in a dam that was already cracking. The afternoon brought witness after witness, each one adding another layer to the picture we were painting. A construction worker who had been paid in cash to keep quiet about safety violations that resulted in serious injuries. A city inspector who admitted to accepting bribes in exchange for overlooking code violations that put entire buildings at risk. A bookkeeper who had kept duplicate records, one set for the IRS and another that showed where money actually went. She was nervous, hands shaking as she explained how she had been instructed to create invoices for work that was never performed, to inflate costs for materials that were never purchased, to make numbers dance in ways that would impress auditors who weren't looking too closely. The most damaging testimony came from my father's former business partner, a man named Frank who had walked away from their company years earlier when the shortcuts became too obvious to ignore. He spoke about corners cut on structural work, about materials substituted with cheaper alternatives that looked the same but wouldn't hold up under stress. He described meetings where my father laughed about regulators who could be bought for the price of a nice dinner and a weekend golf trip. Frank had kept records, not out of malice, but out of the kind of careful paranoia that comes from working with someone who treats laws like suggestions. The photographs he produced showed construction sites where safety equipment was removed before inspections, where load-bearing walls were thinner than blueprints indicated, where electrical work was done by unlicensed contractors who charged half the rate and delivered twice the risk. My father sat through each revelation with a face carved from stone, but I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was a man who had built his life on controlling narratives, on making sure his version of events was the only one anyone heard. But narratives require willing audiences. And this courtroom was filled with people who had heard enough lies to recognize truth when it finally spoke. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of understatement. No theatrical gestures, no appeals to emotion, just a methodical review of evidence that spoke for itself. Money laundering, tax evasion, bribery, fraud, domestic violence. Each charge supported by documents, testimony, and the kind of paper trail that honest people leave when they're trying to hide dishonest acts. The defense attorney did his best with the hand he'd been dealt, but you can't argue with bank statements that show money appearing and disappearing like magic tricks performed by amateurs. He spoke about reasonable doubt, about the presumption of innocence, about the rush to judgment that destroys reputations built over decades. But reputations, I had learned, were just stories people told about themselves. And sometimes those stories needed to be corrected by people brave enough to tell different ones. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Not because the evidence was unclear, but because the scope of my father's crimes was so extensive that it took time to work through every charge, every piece of evidence, every witness statement that painted the picture of a man who had confused power with permission. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady as he read verdict after verdict. Guilty on all counts. The words fell into the courtroom silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through the gallery that would spread far beyond these walls. My father's face didn't change when the verdicts were read, but his shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he had been carrying for years had finally become too heavy to bear. His mistress left the courtroom before sentencing was scheduled, her heels clicking against marble floors with the rapid rhythm of someone fleeing a sinking ship. The judge set sentencing for the following month, but everyone in the courtroom understood that my father's life as he had known it was over. The empire he had built on other people's pain was collapsing, and there would be no rebuilding from the ashes this time. I walked out of that courthouse feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but the quiet peace that comes when justice finally catches up with injustice. The reporters called questions I didn't answer. Cameras flashed pictures I didn't pose for, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the phone call I made from the courthouse steps. My mother's voice when she answered sounded different somehow, lighter, as if she had been holding her breath for decades and could finally exhale. We didn't talk about the verdict or what came next. We talked about small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversations people have when they're not afraid anymore. That night, I sat in my apartment with files spread across my kitchen table, reviewing everything that had led to this moment. Years of careful documentation, patient investigation, the kind of methodical police work that built cases strong enough to survive appeals and legal challenges. But it had started with something, simpler than evidence or testimony. It had started with love. Love for a woman who deserved better than bruises hidden under makeup. Love for a community that deserved honest contractors and fair dealing. Love for a system of justice that only worked when people were brave enough to use it. The sentencing hearing was quieter than the trial, attended by fewer reporters and curious spectators. My father stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller somehow, diminished by circumstances he could no longer control or manipulate. The judge's words were measured but firm, explaining how the sentence reflected not just the crimes committed, but the breach of trust that made those crimes possible. 15 years in federal prison, asset forfeiture that would strip away every property, every account, every material thing he had accumulated through decades of corruption. Restitution that would ensure victims of his fraud received compensation, even if it couldn't undo the damage he had caused. My mother wasn't in the courtroom for sentencing. She had said her piece during the trial, and now she was focused on building something new from what remained. She had moved to a small house by the coast, far enough from our hometown to escape the whispers and stares, close enough to the ocean to hear waves washing old pain from memory's shores. Shores. I visited her there on weekends when my schedule allowed, driving the coastal highway with windows down and salt air filling my lungs like medicine. Her new house sat on a bluff overlooking water that stretched toward horizons she was still learning to trust. The garden she planted that first spring grew wild and stubborn, tomatoes climbing stakes with determination that reminded me of her voice during testimony. We didn't talk much about the trial or what came before it. Instead, we spoke in the language of ordinary days, discussing which flowers bloomed earliest and whether the mailman preferred coffee or tea when he stopped by her porch. She had learned to laugh again, not the careful sound she used to make when someone might be listening, but something genuine that came from places inside her that had been quiet too long. The phone calls from reporters eventually stopped. My father's story became yesterday's news, replaced by fresher scandals and more immediate outrage. But the changes his case set in motion rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, reaching places none of us had expected. The federal investigation expanded beyond our small town, following money trails that connected to other construction companies, other city officials, other men who had confused power with permission. 3 more arrests followed within 6 months, each one unraveling another thread in a web that stretched further than anyone had imagined. The construction company that bore my father's name was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to workers who had been injured by corners cut in the name of profit. The buildings he had constructed were inspected with the kind of thoroughness that should have happened before families moved into them. Some needed structural repairs that cost more than the original construction. My mother received a settlement that gave her security she had never known, money that came without conditions or expectations attached. She used part of it to establish a fund that helped other women leave situations where love had been twisted into control. The rest went toward a life she designed for herself, without asking anyone's permission. I kept working cases, responding to calls that took me into kitchens where women stood over sinks with bruises they couldn't explain. But something had changed in how I carried myself through those moments. The weight of my own family's secrets no longer pressed against my chest when I wrote reports or took photographs that would become evidence. The badge felt different now, lighter somehow, as if it had been cleaned of tarnish I hadn't noticed accumulating over the years. My fellow officers treated me with a respect that went beyond rank or seniority. They had watched me choose duty over family loyalty, and that choice earned something that couldn't be taught in any academy. Peterson's law firm hired additional attorneys to handle the flood of cases that followed my father's conviction. Other families found courage in what we had accomplished, bringing forward their own stories of corruption and abuse that had festered in darkness for too long. The firm established a division dedicated to cases where wealth and power had been used as weapons against the vulnerable. The yacht was seized and sold at federal auction, its proceeds added to the restitution fund that would take years to fully distribute. I never learned who had sent me that photograph, the anonymous message that had crystallized my resolve on a day when I might have walked away from my mother's kitchen without acting. Perhaps it was someone who had been waiting for the right moment to light the fuse on an explosion they knew was coming. My father's mistress disappeared from social media, her carefully curated life of luxury replaced by silence that spoke louder than any confession. Rumors placed her in different cities, working jobs that paid honest wages for honest work. I hoped she had learned something about the cost of being complicit in someone else's cruelty. The house where I grew up was sold to pay legal fees and restitution, purchased by a young family who promised to fill it with laughter instead of fear. I drove past it once after they moved in, seeing tricycles on the front porch and children's drawings taped to windows that had once been closed tight against neighbors' curiosity. My mother never asked if I regretted the choices that had torn our family apart and rebuilt it into something more honest. She understood that some questions didn't need answers, that some decisions carried their own justification in the peace they created. We had both learned to sleep without listening for footsteps in hallways, without wondering what mood would greet us at breakfast. The anniversary of my father's conviction passed without ceremony or reflection. It was simply another day in a life that had found its rhythm again, measured not by fear or anticipation but by the ordinary challenges that filled hours with purpose. I worked cases, visited my mother's garden, maintained friendships that didn't require careful editing of truth. Sometimes, late at night when the station was quiet and paperwork was caught up, I would think about the moment everything changed. Not the courtroom drama or the media attention, but that instant in my mother's kitchen, when I saw her reflection in dishwater and understood that silence had become its own form of violence. The file folders that had once filled my spare bedroom were stored now in Peterson's office, part of a case study that law students would examine for years to come. But the real lesson wasn't in the legal precedents or investigative techniques. It was in the recognition that justice sometimes required breaking the very bonds that were supposed to make it impossible. My mother planted herbs that summer, basil and rosemary and thyme that filled her kitchen with scents that had nothing to do with cleaning up blood or tears. She cooked meals that took hours to prepare, not because anyone expected perfection, but because she had finally learned to take pleasure in the process of creation rather than the fear of destruction. We established traditions that belonged only to us. Sunday dinners where conversation flowed like wine we were finally old enough to appreciate. She taught me recipes she had never shared before, family secrets that had been locked away with so many others. I taught her to change oil in her car, to balance her checkbook, to navigate the world as someone who owed explanations to no one. The restraining order that protected her from my father's contact expired after 3 years, but renewal was automatic. He had made no attempts to reach her from prison, perhaps understanding finally that some bridges burn completely when they're built from lies. His parole hearing wouldn't come for another decade, and by then we would both be different people living different lives. I received commendations for the investigation that brought him down, recognition that felt hollow compared to the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The real reward was in phone calls from other officers who had built similar cases, following trails of evidence that led to powerful men who had forgotten that power came with limits. The department created new protocols for handling domestic violence cases involving prominent citizens, procedures that ensured wealth and reputation couldn't shield abusers from consequences. Training programs that taught officers to recognize the subtle signs of control that didn't always leave visible bruises, but carved wounds that took years to heal. My mother's bruises faded to memory, but the strength that had carried her through testimony and cross-examination grew brighter with each passing season. She volunteered at shelters where women learned to rebuild lives from fragments, sharing wisdom that came from surviving what many thought was unsurvivable. The coastal house became a sanctuary not just for her but for others who needed space to heal without judgment or pressure to forgive before they were ready. She kept guest rooms prepared for visitors who arrived with nothing but courage and left with plans that extended beyond the next day or week. I visited when I could, bringing case files I could discuss, and stories I couldn't share from a career that had found new purpose in the aftermath of old pain. We walked beaches where waves erased footprints but left behind shells and sea glass, treasures that revealed themselves only to those patient enough to search for beauty in what others might consider wreckage. The fund we established grew beyond what either of us had imagined, fed by donations from people who understood that justice required investment from those who benefited from systems that worked. Grants went to legal aid organizations, shelters, programs that taught women to recognize their own worth before someone else decided to diminish it. My father's letters from prison went unanswered, not from cruelty but from understanding that some conversations could only happen when both parties were ready to speak honestly. His words, filtered through institutional mail systems, carried apologies that felt more like negotiations than genuine remorse. The town where I grew up slowly healed from the scandal that had revealed corruption in foundations everyone had trusted. New contractors emerged, honest ones who submitted bids that reflected actual costs and completed work that met safety standards. Building inspectors who understood their responsibility to families who would live in structures they approved. My career continued along paths that felt more purposeful now, investigating cases where wealth had been used to purchase silence, where power had been wielded against those who couldn't fight back with equal resources. Each closed case felt like a small payment against a debt I owed to women who had suffered in silence, while I wore a badge that could have protected them sooner. The badge itself became something different after my father's conviction. Not just a symbol of authority, but a reminder of responsibility that extended beyond strangers' emergencies to the quiet crises that happened behind closed doors. I wore it with pride that had been earned through choices that cost everything and gave back more than I had imagined possible. Some nights, when the ocean wind carried salt through my mother's kitchen windows, we would sit over tea and speak about futures that stretched beyond the horizon line. Plans that didn't require permission from anyone, dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed by years of walking carefully around someone else's anger. The justice system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but ultimately completely, because people had been brave enough to trust it with truth. Documents had spoken when voices had been silenced, evidence had testified when witnesses had been too frightened to appear, and the law had protected those who had never believed they deserved protection. They deserved protection. The years that followed moved like seasons, each one bringing changes that settled into the landscape of our lives with the quiet permanence of trees growing taller. My mother's house by the coast became a place where healing happened in layers, the way paint builds up on old walls until you can't see the scars underneath anymore. I found myself driving those coastal roads more often, drawn by something deeper than duty or habit. The salt air seemed to wash away the residue that accumulated from too many crime scenes, too many reports written in the careful language that turns human suffering into official documentation. Out there, with waves erasing yesterday's footprints, the weight of the badge felt manageable again. The fund we'd established grew beyond what either of us had anticipated. Donations arrived from places I'd never heard of, accompanied by letters written in careful script by women who understood what silence cost. Some shared stories that made my own family's ordeal seem almost simple by comparison. Others sent just a few dollars with notes that said, "For someone who needs a fresh start," or "Because everyone deserves a door that locks from the inside." My mother threw herself into the work with an energy that surprised us both. She learned to use computers, to navigate databases, to speak the language of nonprofits and grant applications. Watching her master skills she'd never been allowed to develop felt like watching a garden bloom after a long drought. Her voice grew stronger in meetings, her opinions sharper, her instincts about which cases deserved immediate attention almost supernatural in their accuracy. The first woman we helped was barely 20, with twin toddlers and a black eye that makeup couldn't quite hide. She'd found our information on a bulletin board at a grocery store, tucked between advertisements for used furniture and part-time jobs. My mother sat with her in the kitchen of the coastal house while I played with the children on the porch, their laughter mixing with the sound of waves that never stopped promising tomorrow would be different. We paid for her security deposit on a small apartment 3 towns away, covered the cost of changing her name and her children's, arranged for childcare so she could finish the nursing degree she'd abandoned when marriage became a cage instead of a choice. 6 months later, she sent a photograph of herself in scrubs, standing beside a hospital sign with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. The last time I saw my father was at a parole hearing 3 years ago. He looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit, his voice hoarse from years of breathing recycled prison air. He spoke about rehabilitation and second chances, about the man he claimed to have become behind bars. But his eyes still held that calculating gleam, the same look he'd worn while counting money that belonged to other people, while washing blood from his knuckles with the same soap my mother used on dishes. Some storms change the landscape forever, others just teach you to build stronger foundations.